Hey guys, welcome to CraterMania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'd like to welcome you all back to the 500 movies in 2025. And for this week, this will be movies number 364 through 369. So there's some doubters out there, Crater Maniacs. There's some people out there who thinks that Crater can't get to 500 movies in 2025. Well, I've not got to 400 yet. That's true. And we got just little over a month left in this year. So, like, we're almost to the end of October, getting ready to roll into November. So, really, I mean, there's about 2 months left, to be honest with you. If you count the whole month of November and then all of December, we've got about 2 months. Maybe so a little over 2 months, actually. Um, So I think we can still accomplish this. I mean, yeah, there's going to be doubters for anything out there. There's going to be people that's going to be like, you can't do this, you can't do that. Well, I say whatever to that. I'm going to try. If even I can't make it to 500 at this point, I'm going to try my damnedest. And still, this is going to be the most amount of movies that I've ever watched in my life in a singular year. So, and I'm having a blast with it. And, I was supposed to done the stream that I'm doing right now. I was supposed to done this last week, but just had a few things come up, including a late birthday present for my wife. So I got to go see my favorite band in the world, AFI or A Fire Inside, in Nashville, Tennessee last Saturday. So just we had an absolute blast at that show, and just a ton of other AFI fans there. Just a great crowd, great show, best show I've ever seen personally live from AFI. So yeah, just had a blast doing that. So yeah, sorry that I wasn't able to do this show last weekend. And then we stayed all night on Nashville last Saturday night, and then came home on Sunday. And by the time we got home on Sunday, I was just wore out, completely wore out. Um, so I wasn't able to do the stream on Sunday either. But here I am back on Friday, October the 24th, 2025, with another rendition of my Halloween Hoedown series this October. Um, so for this episode, and before I get into that, so I got a couple other streams coming up this weekend as well. So I got one tomorrow night, Saturday night. I'm going to be continuing the Halloween Hoedown. And then on Sunday, continuing the Halloween Hoedown on that as well. But for Sunday, even though it is a part of the Halloween Hoedown series, they're not technically Halloween movies, but they are set around the time of Halloween, even though they never mention anything about Halloween in these movies. And that's going to be the Back to the Future trilogy, celebrating the 40th anniversary this year of the original Back to the Future. So if you're a Back to the Future fan, be sure to check out that stream this Sunday, October 26th, 2025, which will be 40 years to the date that Marty McFly went back in time to 1955. So be sure to check that out. If you're a fan of Back to the Future, I'll be sure to not let you down. But we're going to be, like I said, going back to what I was saying earlier about, there's some doubters out there that doesn't think that I'm going to be able to make it to 500 movies. Well, I'm out to prove them wrong. And so let's just continue along with tonight's movies, number 364 through 369. And for this first movie, I've been a devoted fan of Tim Burton's just kind of uniquely gothic aesthetic. I've been an admirer for years of just Johnny Depp and his like chameleon like performances, and just someone who also just finds an almost you know spiritual connection with just Christina Ricci's bewitching presence. I mean, I had an absolute crush on this woman ever since I was a kid. And so just kind of diving into this movie, Tim Burton's 1999 rendition of Sleepy Hollow, it felt less like watching a movie, and more like stepping into kind of a familiar, and thrilling dream. For those of for those of us who have just eagerly await this time of year every year, this the and just those that generally embrace all things spooky that Halloween signifies. Sleepy Hollow is just one of those movies that you've got to watch every year. It's like an annual pilgrimage. You got to watch this movie almost every year around this time of year. It's just kind of this cinematic confection, just perfectly crafted to kind of satisfy that specific craving, for that intelligent and just atmospheric and just, that utterly enchanting, Halloween spirit. Um, and just to truly appreciate Sleepy Hollow, we got to first understand, what it is in its kind of, detailed entirety. So this was released in 1999, and it was this gothic horror masterpiece, directed by Tim Burton, and the screenplay was written by Andrew Kevin Walker, and it was just, it was basically based loosely on Washington Irving's, 1820 short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And so this film, it kind of ventures, far beyond that simple tale, of a headless horseman and, Ichabod Crane. So, Paramount Pictures, Mandalay Pictures, Scott Rudin Productions, and Tim Burton Productions, they all collaborated together to bring this vision to life. And like I said, it stars Johnny Depp as this New York City police constable Ichabod Crane, and you have Christina Ricci, who is this very intriguing Katrina Van Tassel, who is the daughter to like the village's most you know affluent resident, which is played by Michael Gambon, who a lot of Harry Potter fans know as the second Dumbledore in the Harry Potter movie series. Um, but the story plunges us into this kind of bleak autumn of not of 1799, and Ichabod Crane, like I said, he's this constable who's notable for his scientific and rational and just frankly rather peculiar methods. Is he's dispatched to this isolated Dutch village of Sleepy Hollow, and his mission is to investigate this series of just gruesome and inexplicable decapitations that have just plunged the community into pure horror, to pure terror. So upon his arrival in Sleepy Hollow, he's met by, the village elders, which is Baltus Van Tassel, who is this very rich farmer. You have Dr. Thomas Lancaster, Reverend Steenwick, James Hardenbrook, and the magistrate. What's his name? Samuel Phillips, I think is his name. So they inform him of this local terrifying belief that the killer is this ghostly undead apparition of this headless horseman, or this Hessian mercenary, who is this phantom that is seeking his lost skull. And Ichabod Crane, he is this, he's kind of a skeptic in the face of everything that's supernatural. So he embarks on this investigation. He finds himself, living, with the Van Tassels, where he becomes, increasingly entangled with Katrina, played by Christina Ricci. She's this woman of just this absolute beauty and this very mysterious allure about her, whose kind of supposed connection to the occult begins to fascinate him. So as the body count is rising, Ichabod now, who's assisted by this determined son of a previous victim, Jonathan Masbeth, they delve deeper into this kind of conspiracy, that transcends that merely ghost like presence. So his kind of scientific mind, it grapples with this evidence that that defies logic. A victim found pregnant. The just the uncanny ability to strike seemingly at will from the horseman, and just that kind of realization that this kind of terrifying entity is being controlled. And I think the brilliance of Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow lies in its kind of departure from the source material, while kind of remaining loyal to its spirit. And while the original story is kind of a more subtle, atmospheric ghost tale, Tim Burton's film just kind of explodes with this very vivid, almost darkly humorous gothic horror. You know, and the development for the film began as early as 1993. So they started like way before this was even released, years and years before it. And there was initially there was a different vision in mind. So initially it was supposed to be like a low budget slasher film, under director Kevin Yeager, who was later relegated to the prosthetic makeup designer for this film. um, and when Tim Burton, took the helm in June 1998, he just completely, reimagined the project, and they filmed from November 1998 to May of 1999. And just the production was this kind of international undertaking, blending just American and German creative forces within it. And just the result was just this kind of cinematic, spectacle almost. It just really and it premiered at the Chinese Theater on November 17th, 1999, and it was released to the public on November 19th. So it just kind of garnered this widespread, critical acclaim, and just this, it got this respectable box office gross of $207 million, and it even got an Academy Award for Best Art Direction, which I think is just a testament to the visual, you know, just um, just the amazing visuals within this film. But the plot of Sleepy Hollow is very intricate and beautifully layered. So Ichabod's investigation leads him to just kind of uncover this complex web of just deceit and greed and revenge. And he learns that the Van Garrett family, which is the initial victims, were entangled in this secret, you know um and that were their the secret marriage, and just a new uh will that would disinherit the Van Tassels. So the victims are revealed to be either beneficiaries, or witnesses to this will, just kind of pointing towards a conspiracy that was orchestrated by the village's most prominent figure, Baltus Van Tassel, as the prime suspect, and just kind of acting through the horseman. However, the truth is actually far more twisted. So Katrina, initially perceived as a potential victim or even a suspect, just due to her occult learnings, you know, she bravely confronts her stepmother, Mary Van Tassel, and it's revealed that Mary, originating from a family wronged by the Van Garretts years prior, has orchestrated this entire affair. And so she has manipulated the community, just seduced the elders, and even murdered Katrina's own mother to assume her place. So her ultimate goal is revenge and the acquisition of the Van Garrett and Van Tassel estates. So she has used the horseman, whom she witnessed slain as a child. She went in his actual human life. She was the little girl they show at the beginning that actually witnessed the horseman being decapitated. You know, and so she's using the horseman now like as her instrument, just performing these dark rituals, to keep his head severed and his spirit bound to her will. And the ending here is just a breathtaking ballet of just horror and heroism. As Mary is, summons the horsemen to kill Katrina, and Ichabod and Masbeth, or I'm sorry, um, when she gets the horseman to kill Katrina, Ichabod and Masbeth, they race to her rescue. So this kind of frantic, this chase kind of ensues, just and it culminates all at the Tree of the Dead, where is the horseman's portal to our world. And in this kind of pivotal act of just both courage and understanding, Ichabod retrieves the horseman's skull from Mary and returns it to the horseman himself. So, with his head now restored, the horseman's vengeful rage kind of subsides. You know what I mean? Like, so he spares Katrina, and with this kind of final glance, he departs back to hell, and he takes Mary with him. So that conspiracy, unravels. Just the true villain is vanquished here, and that supernatural threat is neutralized. So Ichabod, no longer the kind of detached rationalist, has embraced the extraordinary, and he decides to leave Sleepy Hollow, taking Katrina and Masbeth with him to forge this new life in New York. Just forever changed by these horrors and the love that he found in this haunted village. And, Sleepy Hollow, this version of Sleepy Hollow is without question my favorite cinematic interpretation of that story. It just kind of captures that spirit of Halloween, that spirit of the fall, and the atmosphere, which is kind of very unparalleled, intensity. Um, the film is just a visual feast, just a testament to Tim Burton's just unparalleled ability to craft these worlds that are both darkly beautiful and just utterly captivating. And just the production design, the costumes, the fog drenched landscapes, just every element is just crafted to kind of immerse the viewer in this kind of heightened reality. Like, the iconic Tree of the Dead is just a brutal, just skeletal marvel, just a fitting gateway for such, this terrifying entity. And the village itself feels ancient, and its inhabitants are just its inhabitants just have this kind of tapestry of fear and superstition and just these kind of hidden agendas. And then you have Johnny Depp's Ichabod Crane is just far from the meek schoolmaster of the original story. Tim Burton's Ichabod is just this very fascinating eccentric figure. um his scientific instruments and just that kind of analytical mind are just comically placed against these kind of encroaching and undeniable supernatural. Johnny Depp just imbues this character with just a very nervous energy, and it's a very peculiar grace, just almost like at this kind of a deeply empathetic core. His journey from just rationalist to believer, and ultimately to this valiant hero is just very compelling. And then Christina Ricci, as Katrina, is just a absolutely, like I said earlier, a bewitching presence. I mean, I love Christina Ricci. She just embodies both that kind of fragile allure of a young woman who's caught in this kind of terrifying situation, and just that hidden strength, of someone that is deeply connected to the mystical. And then, Ichabod and Katrina's romance, just amidst all the terror, just feels very genuine and just kind of adds this very crucial layer of humanity to these kind of gothic proceedings. And then, you got the supporting cast, including, Michael Gambon, and you got Christopher Lee, and you got, can't think of the guy's name that played the Emperor in the Star Wars movie. I mean, there's a ton of people in this. There's a Casper Van Dien that is in this as that he played Johnny Rico in Starship Troopers. There's a ton of big name actors in this. Like I said, Michael Gambon and Miranda Richardson. And they all deliver these performances that are just both very nuanced and memorable. Um, and I think the legacy and the impact of Sleepy Hollow is just undeniable. It revitalized the gothic horror genre in a way that felt fresh and exciting for a new generation in the '90s. Um, and going into the new millennium, it proved that intelligent, atmospheric horror could also be visually stunning and and deeply engaging. Um, the film's kind of distinct aesthetic has influenced countless productions that have followed, and it remains this benchmark, for gothic filmmaking. And for Halloween enthusiasts like myself, it's more than just this spooky movie. It's a mood setter. The opening scenes, with the horseman's brutal attack and Ichabod's arrival, just immediately kind of transport you into this Halloween spirit. And just the film's blend of genuine scares and dark humor and just a compelling mystery just really makes it endlessly rewatchable. um, but in conclusion, Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow is an absolute triumph. It's a film that just embraces its source material with the director's bold vision, the stars just captivating performance, and just a storyteller's love for the macabre. For fans of Tim Burton and Johnny Depp, Christina Ricci, and anyone who finds just solace and joy, in the spooky season, Sleepy Hollow is not just a movie. It's a cherished tradition, just a perfectly preserved piece of Halloween magic that continues to enchant and thrill with just every viewing. It's a testament just to the power, of imaginative filmmaking. This dark fairy tale that just reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying truths are those that lie just beneath the surface. Just kind of waiting for, in this case, a peculiar constable with a scientific mind and and a brave heart to uncover them. So definitely watch Sleepy Hollow if you have never seen this version of Sleepy Hollow, or if you're just looking for something you can't decide what to watch this Halloween season. Sleepy Hollow is a no-brainer. I think. I mean, it's definitely one that I love. My wife loves it. We actually, when we watched it this time around, it was my son Noah's first ever viewing of the movie. So and I just knew before he we even watched it with him, I knew he was going to love it, and he could not take his eyes off the movie. He loves Tim Burton, so I thought it was a great way to introduce him to Sleepy Hollow this Halloween season, and you guys should definitely check it out too. But up next on the list here, and I'm wearing my shirt tonight to honor this while I talk about this movie. So Idle Hands. So like I said, when it comes around this time of year, the Halloween season, um, for horror fans everywhere, the kind of annual tradition for a lot of us fans is to just kind of create this perfect Halloween movie marathon, much like I'm doing here on the channel. So, and we pull out the classics, like Carpenter's Halloween, which I'll be covering next week along with the other Halloween films, and just and like a lot of the other movies that I've talked about here on the Halloween Hoedown, this year on the channel. Um, so, and we kind of sprinkle in a few modern masterpieces here and there, but just kind of nestled between the truly terrifying and universally acclaimed, just lies that special category of a film. And that's that Halloween season comfort movie. And this is definitely one of my top Halloween season comfort movies. And because these are the types of films that just kind of perfectly capture, that fun loving spirit of Halloween. They're a little spooky, a lot of fun, and they're just endlessly rewatchable. And just, for me, and I think there's a lot of other fans out there, one of the best movies I think to watch around the Halloween season is this movie, Robin Flinder's 1999 horror comedy masterpiece, Idle Hands. Um, so this movie was kind of dismissed upon its release as, this critical and just commercial failure, like a lot of movies that I talk about here on the channel. But Idle Hands has just since kind of like found its way out of that cinematic graveyard to become this cult classic over the years. Um, it's a film that just understands that the best part, of Halloween isn't just the scares, but just that kind of um, top notch rock and roll, punk rock energy that just comes with it. It's a blood soaked, just like love letter just to slacker culture and potheads and just B movie horror and just this kind of that glorious absurdity, of the late 90s. Um, so at its core, Idle Hands, takes the old saying, "Idle hands are the devil's playground" or playthings or whatever, and and just interprets it with this kind of literality. So we were introduced to Anton Tobias, who was a perfectly casted, Devon Sawa, um, and he's just this kind of platonic ideal of a teenage slacker. His life revolves around just that holy trinity of sleeping in, smoking weed, and watching TV. And his just ambition goes no further than mustering the energy to talk to this girl, his neighbor, Molly, who's played by this very beautiful Jessica Alba. I mean, this is one of her earliest films, and so this kind of lethargic paradise is shattered when Anton discovers his parents have been brutally murdered, and just after this kind of series of just horrifyingly comedic events, he realizes that the culprit is his own right hand, which has become possessed by this demonic force. And what follows is this kind of masterclass, in tone blending. The film doesn't shy away from any kind of gore. Just the opening scene is just genuinely unsettling, and just the following murders, of Anton's best friends, Mick, played by Seth Green, and Penub, played by Eldon Henson, are equally as brutal. So, Mick gets a beer bottle broken over his head and, then impaled through the skull, while, Penub is just, decapitated by this saw blade that Anton throws at him and goes right straight through his neck. So, the film kind of immediately pivots to comedy. The moment that Anton's hand murders his friends, he's overcome with this remorse, just only for the hand to try and stuff their bodies, into this, like, I forget what it was, but anyway, the situation kind of escalates with Mick and Penub. They return from the dead as these kind of wisecracking zombies who are just more concerned with finding snacks or watching TV or whatever, or smoking weed, and then than they are with their own kind of gruesome demise in the current state that they're in. So their undead state just becomes less a source of like horror and more of a running gag. And just provides Anton with the world's kind of most unhelpful support system. But like the film story is just this very chaotic race against like this evil being which is within Anton's hand. So Anton is just kind of fed up with all the carnage, and he takes a meat cleaver and to his own wrists in a scene that is both gruesome and hilarious triumphant. And I feel like a lot of this movie is is a huge tribute to Evil Dead. Because if you look at it, like there is a lot of just instances within this film that will remind you of Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2. Um, but Anton severing his hand only makes everything worse. Makes the hand now more mobile and dangerous. So the climax of this film, takes place at the high school Halloween dance, which is, a setting that is, well known for a lot of teen horror flicks. So, like I said, the hand, which is now free, just kind of scampers through the air vents and is causing mayhem there at the school. And it leads to this kind of iconic scene where it scalps the lead singer of the Offspring, because the whole band makes its cameo as the school dance band, um, before seeing its sights on Molly. So it's up to Anton and his two zombie pals and this badass demon hunter named Debbie, who's played by Vivica A. Fox, to stop this disembodied menace from dragging Molly's soul to hell. Um, and to understand why Idle Hands works so well, you got to look to its director, Robin Flender. While Robin Flender is not a household name like Wes Craven or John Carpenter, but he was just the perfect journeyman, to be the director for this project. Just his previous directorial credits, was Leprechaun 2, which is a movie I talked about earlier this year on the channel. And then that was another film that just kind of walked that tightrope, between horror and just outright comedy. And and Flender, he possesses this kind of clear, affection just for the genre, but none of the pretension. He understands like that assignment is to deliver, this fun and gory, film, and he does so with a lot of style here. I feel, just his direction really keeps that pace just relentlessly brisk. Just never allowing the audience to dwell too long on the absurdity of the premise. So, he expertly stages just that kind of slapstick, sequences of Anton, fighting his own hand. And like I said, it channels that spirit of, Sam Raimi's Evil Dead 2. So, and just the camera work in this film is just dynamic. The practical effects for the severed hand are just wonderfully creative. And he just kind of, brings this very fantastic comedic performances just from the entire cast. Devin Sawa he perfects that art of being the straight man to his own body part, while Seth Green and Eldon Henson, they just kind of achieve this very iconic level of stoner zombie chemistry. Um, but Robin Flanders, just his work here just really proves that a film doesn't need to be like the best movie in the world or whatever to be expertly crafted. Um, but Idle Hands, like I said, it kind of was a critical failure when it came to box office and just upon its release. So it was kind of just almost like snake bitten upon its release. You know what I mean? So um, it dropped into theaters just 10 days after the Columbine High School massacre. So that timing for a violent teen horror comedy could not have been worse. Um, just the marketing was just where audiences were not in the mood for this film, featuring these high schoolers in peril. So it ended up grossing a $4.2 million on a $25 million budget. So it was kind of quickly forgotten by the mainstream, unfortunately. But then, as a lot of these films I talk about here on the channel, something wonderful happened. And that was the home video market, of course. So on VHS and later DVD, Idle Hands just found its true audience within that time. Just kind of free from that kind of unfortunate context um, uh, of its theatrical release. Just viewers discovered just this film that was not only hilarious, but just also just a perfect time capsule of its era. And this is the I think this is the film's greatest legacy. It's unapologetically just a product of 1999. The fashion is a just a sea of just baggy jeans and wallet chains, which is I was very familiar with when I was, eighth grade going into high school. I was in that same type of fashion. Um, the dialogue is just kind of peppered with all that slacker slang, and the soundtrack is has like um is Blink 182, has the Offspring, Rob Zombie. Just it's just a soundtrack of a who's who of the late '90s, just punk and alternative rock and metal. Um, and just watching it today is kind of like digging up this piece of pop culture history. Its cult status was built on this kind of potent, nostalgia and just this, it's undeniable rewatchability. It became this, word of mouth hit, just a staple of a lot of sleepovers with your friends and college dorm rooms. And, I feel like it's a perfect gateway horror film. It was gory enough to satisfy genre fans, but, funny and lighthearted enough to kind of win over the squeamish. You know what I mean? And that central trio of Anton and Mick and Penub just remains, I think, one of the most enduring slacker ensembles in cinema history. And just their friendship, um, even in death or undeath, whichever you want to look at it, kind of gives the film this very surprising amount of heart, I feel. Um, but in conclusion, Idle Hands is a film that wears its heart on its sleeve. I feel it never pretends to be anything more than what it is. It's very entertaining, just endlessly creative, and it's just this very hilariously gruesome horror comedy. It's a celebration of everything that just makes the Halloween season great, and that's the scares, the laughs, that kind of rock and roll attitude, and just that that joy of watching this possessed hand go on this murderous rampage. While it may have been cursed at the box office upon its release, I think its legacy as a beloved cult classic is just a testament to its enduring charm. Just for any horror fan that's looking to round out their October viewing schedule, or and the Halloween season with something that is just pure unadulterated fun, then you can do no better than this. So I just say grab you some snacks, turn up the punk rock and metal, and just let this magnificent, misunderstood gem really take hold. Um, just be sure to keep your own hands busy while you watch. So I'm gonna check out the comments real quick. I see some people in the chat. Um, Jason Huffman, hey there. I wish I could stay up and watch this, but I have to go to bed and work tomorrow. Watch it all as soon as I can. I appreciate that, Jason. Thanks for stopping by, man. No, it's good to see you. Um, but yeah, I mean, definitely check out Idle Hands. Said it's one of my absolute top Halloween comfort movies. And really, it's just a movie I can watch all year round. I mean, even if I can't think of anything else I want to watch, and I'm just in like a very like dull, bored, like type of mindset, I'm definitely going to throw on Idle Hands because I know it's always going to be a good time every time I watch it. But moving on to the next movie. So just to kind of keep up with that horror comedy theme that there is with Idle Hands, this next movie, um, so every year, like around this time, this is another good one to watch during this time. It's based around the Halloween season, and it's just based on a lot of different horror movies that it's poking fun at. So like I said, we can always revisit those classics like Halloween and all these other classic horror movies and Halloween themed movies around this time of year. But, like I said, I'm a huge fan of horror comedies. And, for those of us who believe that, the best scares are just kind of often accompanied by, a belly laugh, this film is just absolutely non-negotiable on the playlist. I mean, it's one of those top horror comedies you always got to watch. It is this this masterpiece from the year 2000, and that is Scary Movie. So more than 2 decades later, this film isn't just a nostalgic artifact. It is just this brilliantly constructed. It's crude and just hilarious. It's very effective parody that just both celebrates and at the same time destroys the horror themes that we hold so dear. Um, so, at its core, Scary Movie is just this direct and just, relentless parody of the late 90s slasher revival, which was, it primarily targeted Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer. Um, so the story begins on Halloween night with, this iconic, murder of Drew Decker, who was perfectly casted with, a Carmen Electra. And so, she's chased by this familiar ghost face killer, and her demise, it just involves this, a ripped off dress and her silicone implant gets stabbed out of her chest, and she's being run over by her own distracted father. Distracted. So I will not say what was really going on there, but so the opening sets this tone perfectly. Just um nothing is sacred, and just every moment of terror from the source material will be twisted into this absolute absurdity. Um, so from there, we get to meet the cast, led by this sweet but clueless Cindy Campbell, played by Anna Faris, and this is the role that absolutely made her a star. And then along with her boyfriend Bobby, and Brenda Meeks, played by Shannon Elizabeth. Then you have that closeted Jock Ray, played by Sean Wayans. Um, and I forget the other one's name. I said Brenda is actually played by, I forget her name, but like she's in all of these. But it's the other one is Buffy is played by Shannon Elizabeth. But anyway, and then you have Brenda's stoner brother Shorty, played by Marlon Wayans. So Cindy, finds her friend group being stalked by this same killer, and the reason is because exactly 1 year prior to this, they were involved in this hit and run, dumping the body in a lake and swearing to secrecy. Like, I Know What You Did Last Summer. So while this kind of, that framework, like I said, mirrors I Know What You Did Last Summer, the execution is primarily parroting Scream. So the characters are hunted, and they're taunted through these phone calls, and just they're picked off in these kind of increasingly ludicrous ways. Like Greg's murder happens in plain sight during Buffy's beauty pageant, while where the audience mistakes her pleas for help as this dramatic performance. Like, oh my gosh, she's great, and she's really just reacted to her boyfriend being killed by Ghostface. Um, and then you got Brenda's iconic death in this movie theater, and it isn't at the hands of the killer, but by these enraged audience members in the theater who are just fed up with her being so loud and giving this obnoxious commentary during a showing of Shakespeare in Love. So the film just kind of gleefully weaves in these spoofs of other cultural touchstones of the era, from like that slow motion bullet dodging of the Matrix, to like the close up like shot from Blair Witch Project, to even the reveal of just the usual suspects. So it's just kind of this pop culture blender that's set high, and just that resulting cocktail is just intoxicatingly funny. um Jason said, I can't wait to get to the part about my. Oh yeah, so that'll be May will be the last movie I'll be talking about tonight, Jason. So yeah, definitely check that out whenever you get a chance, man. Again, I appreciate you stopping by. So that used to get talked about somewhat in the early 2000s. Seen the. Yeah, I agree, man. Like I definitely agree with that, because May, and I'll talk more about that here in a little bit, but that's a very very underrated film. And it's not primarily associated with Halloween, but the ending of the movie takes place on Halloween. But again, like I said, I'll talk about that here in a little bit. But yeah, again, appreciate you stopping by, man. I really do. Um, but getting back to Scary Movie, just to understand why Scary Movie works so well, you just have to look at this director, Keenan Ivory Wayans, and just the creative team, which included, his brothers Sean and Marlon. Keenan was just the mind behind the groundbreaking, sketch comedy show In Living Color, which I grew up loving that show. That show is the reason why I became a Jim Carrey fan. And, to me, Jim Carrey is the greatest comedian of all time. Um, In Living Color was just a series that, redefined, television comedy with this kind of fearless, just boundary pushing and that kind of racially charged humor. That show was a training ground for just a generation of comedic talent. And, it established that whole Wayans brand, which is a style that is smart and satirical and just completely, unafraid to just to dive head first, into that kind of physical and gross out gags. And I loved it, just this whole sensibility is just imprinted on every frame of Scary Movie. Just the film just kind of moves with that kind of rapid fire, pace of a sketch show, just jumping from one gag to the next without giving, the audience a moment to breathe. But I think that's absolutely why this works. And I can remember when I went and watched this movie when it was in theaters. My parents did not want to take me, so I had to go with a friend of mine and his dad to watch this. And man, just watching this movie in the theater when it came out with other people in the audience was just an absolute experience that I'll never forget. And just the Wayans family understands that that the best parodies, come from this place of love and just deep knowledge of, the source material. They don't just mock Scream. They just dissect its structure and the character types and just, the most famous scenes, and then they just reassemble them all with this kind of gleeful absurdity that just only, these true fans could achieve. So their direction really ensures that even, the most juvenile jokes, land with just absolute precision and really creates this kind of rhythm of shock and laughter that is just, this relentlessly entertaining. And just the impact of Scary Movie cannot be overstated. Commercially, it was a phenomenon. It grossed over $278 million worldwide on just a $19 million budget. And it just became this kind of cultural like touchstone overnight. But I think its true legacy just lies in how it kind of revitalized, this this very dormant genre. So, the golden age of parody films, which is, dominated by classics like Airplane and The Naked Gun, had, kind of largely faded out by the late 90s. So Scary Movie single-handedly just resurrected that genre, for a new millennium. And, and speaking of Airplane and The Naked Gun, which part of the cast of those movies was Leslie Nielsen, we would later see Leslie Nielsen come into the Scary Movie franchise. So, like I said, it just Scary Movie had single-handedly resurrected, just that genre for a new millennium, and it just created this formula, that would be copied for better and, often for worse, for the next decade. It launched these careers of Anna Faris and Regina Hall. That's what I was trying to think. Regina Hall, who played Brenda. They end up becoming these almost comedy legends. Just based on their, unforgettable performances as Cindy and Brenda. And funny enough, Regina Hall, who played Brenda, she would go on to be in um, Malibu's Most Wanted, which starred Jamie Kennedy, who was Randy in Scream. So anyway, this the comedic timing and just the that commitment to this film's insanity is definitely, its heart and soul. Just the movie, embedded itself into this kind of cultural popularity that with just with quotable lines like the "What's up?" and which was, at the time there was I think it was a Budweiser commercial, which is what they threw in there. Which so it was, so that wasn't parodying anything from a horror film. It was just kind of like incorporating that pop culture of things that were going on TV and things at the time. Like so, like that whole sequence, just ended up becoming a global phenomenon on its own. And just Shorty's stoner logic, just provided some of the film's most memorable moments, in my opinion. But of course, like I said, it the success that this film brought, it would spawn four sequels, and just like I said, like a wave of inferior imitators like Date Movie and Epic Movie, Disaster Movie. I think there was like one called Superhero Movie. They which all kind of tarnished that reputation, of the parody genre by just focusing solely on these kind of fleeting pop culture references without any kind of clever structural satire, of the original. Yet, I think this only makes the first Scary Movie, shine brighter in retrospect, though. It stands as a testament to that formula that was done right, just a perfect balance of, clever genre deconstruction and that character based humor and just that uh, unapologetic, slapstick humor. Um, but in conclusion, in this kind of vast landscape, of Halloween films, Scary Movie definitely occupies a very unique and cherished space. It's like a time capsule of the year 2000, yet its humor feels strangely timeless because it's aimed at this kind of enduring these enduring themes of horror. So for fans who have watched Scream, and I know what you did last summer, countless times like I have, this Scary Movie almost plays like a bonus commentary track, written by these very funny, people, you know, that were known for this type of humor for years and years. And it's just so it's a film that's kind of made with this very infectious energy and just this genuine affection, for the movies that it spoofs. It's rude, it's crude, it's one of the most brilliant horror comedies ever made, I think. So definitely this Halloween, uh after you've had your feel of genuine terror, just do yourself a favor and revisit Scary Movie. It's a scream in every sense of the word. So yeah, definitely go and revisit Scary Movie. If you've never seen Scary Movie, what the fuck are you waiting for? Go watch this movie. You will be entertained, no doubt. Give me just a second, guys. You guys like my WrestleMania cup? My nephew gave me. Pretty sweet in it. Um, but yeah, so moving on to the next film. Um, so I mentioned this next film I mentioned a few months back when I was doing my World of Werewolves werewolf movies here on the channel. Um, and I kind of gave an explanation of why I didn't talk about this movie at that time because I definitely wanted to save it as one of my Halloween movies, as it does take place around the season of Halloween. Um, and just in this kind of in that vast, moonlit landscape of werewolf movies, there are, there's a few titans that cast, very long shadows. We have the tragic, universal classic, The Wolf Man, and then you have just the groundbreaking special effects of An American Werewolf in London, and you have that pulpy pack oriented horror of The Howling. So for decades, these films have, defined that subgenre, just focusing almost exclusively on the male struggle against the inner beast. But then at the turn of the millennium, there was this low budget Canadian film that came out of the suburbs and didn't just join the canon. I feel like it ripped it to shreds and just remade it in its own image. And that film is my favorite werewolf movie that there is, and that's Ginger Snaps. Ginger Snaps is this masterpiece of just body horror, just this tale of sisterhood, and just without a doubt, like I said, it's my favorite werewolf movie of all time. You know, it also, just is the film that just cemented Catherine Isabel as this beautiful horror icon in my eyes. Um, so for the uninitiated, Ginger Snaps, like I said, is this 2000 Canadian supernatural horror film, werewolf film. Just was directed by John Fawcett, and it was brilliantly written by Karen Walton. So the story centers on the Fitzgerald sisters, Bridget, played by Emily Perkins, and Ginger, played by Catherine Isabel. So, and they're these two kind of inseparable, death obsessed teenagers that are just trapped in the soul crushing, landscape of suburban Bailey Downs. Um, so they're united by this kind of childhood pact, to escape their town or die together by the age of 16. They are these outcasts by choice. They find solace only in just their morbid fantasies and kind of shared disdain for normalcy. Um, this their grim world is just irrevocably, shattered this one night, and as Ginger experiences, her first period, which is as a milestone that she kind of greets with disgust. Just that scent of blood attracts this creature that has just been savaging these local dogs around the town. So the beast attacks, biting Ginger, before being run down by this van, just driven by this local stoner and botanist named Sam. Um, so Ginger's wounds start to heal with this unnatural speed. But this is only the beginning of this kind of metamorphosis she's going through. So as the next full moon approaches, she begins to change, not just physically, with hair sprouting from her scars and just, a tail beginning to grow, but she's also changing psychologically. So just that sullen, withdrawn girl becomes, aggressive and confident and just sexually, predatory, and Bridget, who is the more reserved and observant of the two, she's watching all this in horror as she's losing, her sister to this primal curse, one that is just, inextricably linked to that very biological processes of becoming a woman. So her desperate search for a cure with, that reluctant help of Sam, just forms this kind of emotional core of a film that that uses the whole werewolf mythology as, this ferocious and just clever metaphor for the horrors of female puberty. Um, and just to understand the kind of film's sharp, very thematic focus, the director here, John Fawcett, he has a variety of credits. I think his most significant telling work, post Ginger Snaps, is the acclaimed television series Orphan Black, which he co-created. Um, so the connection is impossible to miss. Both works are masterclasses in exploring female identity, and bodily autonomy, and just that sisterhood, under extreme, distress. So, like Orphan Black's exploration of clones, grappling with their, kind of manufactured existence, and just the forces that seek to control them, really echoes Ginger Snap's, raw portrayal of a young woman's body being violently commandeered by, the supernatural force. Um, and John Fawcett has just a profound talent for, grounding these high concept, sci-fi and horror in deeply human and specifically female, emotional reality. He doesn't just direct monsters; he directs the complex and the messy and just powerful, relationships, between women who are just kind of navigating these worlds that want to, define or destroy them. Um, and like I've stated before, back even when I was doing my werewolf films here on the channel, I'm an absolute werewolf fanatic. I love the folklore, the tragedy, just that sheer visceral terror, of a human transforming into a beast. But Ginger Snaps just kind of resonated with me in a way no other film in the subgenre ever has. It really achieved this by making, its central metaphor so powerful and just flawlessly executed. The transformation into a werewolf isn't just a curse, it's puberty for her just turned up to 11. The mood swings, the sudden hair growth and in strange places, just the bleeding, the burgeoning sexuality, it's all there. It all amplified through just that lens of a werewolf, of a werewolf film. So the curse is monthly, tied to just the lunar cycle, and just the film brilliantly kind of subverts the genre by making this, the monstrous feminine, exploring the fear and shame and just newfound power that just kind of comes with that changing female body. So at the heart of this perfect storm, is Catherine Isabel's just performance as Ginger. Before the bite, she is all sharp edges and just that coiled adolescent anger. But after, she doesn't just become a monster. She blossoms into this kind of terrifyingly, magnetic predator. And Catherine Isabel, charts Ginger's transformation with just a breathtaking precision. There's the initial confusion followed by this thrilling embrace of her new power as she kind of struts through her high school hallways and intimidating these bullies and seducing boys with this kind of dangerous new confidence. And Catherine Isabel makes you believe in Ginger's seduction by the power of the beast. She never loses sight of the tragedy, just allowing these glimpses, of the scared girl that's trapped inside this monster, especially in her kind of increasingly, fraught interactions with Bridget. So her chemistry with with Emily Perkins in this film is the film's soul. I feel like they're kind of codependent, loving and just ultimately, doomed relationship is one of the most authentic like sibling dynamics in horror history, in my opinion. It was this kind of fearless, complex and just captivating performance that just really made me a lifelong fan, not just of this movie, but of Catherine Isabel, of Emily Perkins, everybody involved here. Then we got Mimi Rogers even makes his appearance in the movie as Ginger and Bridget's mother. But Catherine Isabel though she just commands the screen every time she's on screen, just ensuring that even at her most monstrous, that Ginger just remains a character of profound depth and yeah, just a profound depth. And despite the critical acclaim, Ginger Snaps was not a box office smash upon its release either. However, like the curse at its center, its influence grew quietly and just powerfully over time. It's since kind of amassed this devoted cult following, and it's now rightfully regarded as this almost like a feminist horror landmark. Um, and just the academics and critics that have extensively analyzed its themes and just celebrated as a film that just reclaims body horror, from a female perspective. It stands as this kind of defiant counterpoint to decades of horror films where female characters were largely relegated to victims or these as the final girls or whatever. um So, here in this film, the protagonists are, messy and angry and complex, and just the horror emanates directly from their own biology and psychology. Its legacy can be seen in just the wave of intelligent, female centric horror that followed. Films like Jennifer's Body and Teeth, and which kind of similarly use supernatural or horrific events to explore, the female experience. And the film spawned, a solid sequel, Ginger Snaps 2 Unleashed, and it also had this pretty cool Ginger Snaps Back, the beginning. So it cemented its place as this beloved horror franchise, and furthermore, it set against this backdrop of a suburban Halloween, which culminates in this school party and this final bloody confrontation at home. It has also just become, this very essential spirit of Halloween viewing for horror fans who just love that specific atmosphere of the season, which is a time of mask and transformation and just all these things that go bump in the night. But I guess in conclusion, Ginger Snaps is far more than a simple creature feature. It is just this allegory for adolescence and just this heartbreaking story, of the sisterly love and loss, and just a showcase for one of the most powerful performances I think in modern horror. Excuse me. And John Fawcett, and Karen Walton, they just crafted this film that is intelligent and it's gory and it's just emotionally resonant and just endlessly rewatchable. For any horror fan, especially for lovers of werewolves, and thoughtful horror, and just the Halloween season itself, it remains, I think, a high watermark of the genre. It's a film that just really bites deep and really leaves a permanent mark on people. Um, and I just think that continues to echo ferociously and brilliantly, more than 2 decades later. Um, so yeah, definitely check out Ginger Snaps if you've never seen it. I highly recommend it. It's my favorite werewolf film of all time. So yeah, check that out. But moving on to the next movie. So this is a movie that I discovered when I was in high school, upon its release on VHS, and I absolutely love this movie. But I get so upset because when this movie was released on VHS, I rented it from my local video store called Crossfire Video, and it wasn't really well known at the time of its release. And I'll get more into that in just a little bit, but I remember watching this movie and absolutely falling in love with it. And I went to school the next week and was like telling all my friends about it, recommending it to them, like, hey, you got to check out this movie. And then they're always like, yeah, okay, well, we'll watch it sometime, whatever. And it was like never mentioned again. I never heard anybody else for like 4 or 5 years after this even talk about the movie. And then suddenly it it blew up out of nowhere, had this huge cult following. I mean, you were seeing merchandise from the film all over Hot Topics stores, and tons of people who I'd told about this movie years prior were now like, "Oh man, have you seen this movie? I love it." I'm like, "Yeah, motherfucker, I told you about it like 5 years ago." So, so I kind of have this really just weird like feeling whenever I love this movie, but I also like get upset because like when I try to tell people about this movie, they wouldn't listen to me. So anyway, um, like I said, there's certain films that just kind of feel linked to a specific time of year, and this is another one of those films where it's definitely linked to the season of Halloween, to the spirit of Halloween. Um, and this movie, it just kind of, it stands up there as another one of those movies I absolutely love, especially around this time of year. And that's Richard Kelly's Donnie Darko. It isn't a horror film in the traditional sense. Um, there's no jump scares or mass killers or whatever. Well, I mean, there kind of is like a mass killer, but anyway, we'll get into that. But it kind of captures that kind of melancholic, mysterious, and just spiritually charged atmosphere around this time of year. Just as good as any other. Um, and as a just a lifelong fan of both, mind bending time travel stories and just films that are kind of steeped in that Halloween lore. Donnie Darko is just this like cinematic lightning strike, just a perfect storm of genre and mood and just, philosophical inquiry that just kind of continues to haunt and fascinate me 2 decades after its release. I absolutely love this movie. um it's Donnie Darko is just this coming of age story, just wrapped in this sci-fi enigma, just kind of set against the backdrop of this suburban America in October of 1988. So the film introduces us to Donnie, who is this very mesmerizing. This launched Jake Gyllenhaal's career, and Donnie is this very troubled, but fiercely intelligent teenager, and just wrestling with what his therapist diagnoses as paranoid schizophrenia. His mundane life of just family dinners and high school classes and just first crushes is just violently interrupted on this night of October the 2nd, 1988. So, he's lured from his bed by this disembodied voice, and he sleepwalks onto this local golf course where he encounters Frank, this terrifying and prophetic figure in this monstrous rabbit costume. And Frank delivers, this chilling message to Donnie, the world will end in 28 days, 6 hours, 42 minutes, and 12 seconds. And, when Donnie returns home the next morning, he finds his bedroom has been obliterated by this jet engine that has fallen from the sky. And, inexplicably, no plane has been reported missing. So this bizarre accident is just the whole catalyst for the film's, central mystery. Donnie has cheated death, but in doing so, he has seemingly become entangled in this like cosmic paradox. Um, so he's guided by his visions of Frank, and he begins to explore just the nature of time and reality. And this quest leads him to this mysterious book, which is the philosophy of time travel. And it was written by this reclusive local woman known as Grandma Death, or her real name being Roberta Sparrow. Um, so the book kind of details these concepts like tangent universes, the living receiver, the manipulated dead, just providing this cryptic, framework for these strange events that are just unfolding all around Donnie. So as the 28-day countdown to Halloween progresses, Donnie's actions, which are manipulated by Frank, begin to kind of ripple through his community. He floods his school. He exposes this hypocrisy of this smarmy self-help guru named Jim Cunningham, who's played by the late Patrick Swayze. He falls in love with this new girl, Gretchen. Um, and each act, just kind of serves a purpose within the film's, temporal mechanics, just pushing Donnie towards, this final, devastating choice. And the climax occurs, fittingly at a Halloween party, and it leads to the tragedy that forces Donnie to understand his role as the living receiver, the one that was chosen to guide the artifact which in this case is the jet engine, back to the primary universe to prevent this kind of total collapse of reality. Um, so the film's conclusion is just this kind of, masterstroke of emotional and intellectual storytelling. Just a heartbreaking loop that sees Donnie, embrace his fate. And he sacrifices himself to save this world that will never even know that he was its savior. So the final montage, which is set to Gary Jules's haunting cover of Mad World, it shows these characters waking from these troubled dreams and left with this echo of a life that they never lived, which is a very beautiful meditation on fate and love and sacrifice, I feel. um Donnie Darko was just, the feature film debut of Richard Kelly, and it remains the work that he is most known for. So Richard Kelly, he graduated from film school, and he wrote, the script with this kind of singular, ambitious vision, just building this entire universe around, this simple, surreal image of a jet engine crashing into a suburban home. And securing funding was definitely a struggle. It was only through the support of Drew Barrymore's production company, Flower Films, um, that the film was made on this kind of modest $4.5 million budget. And Drew Barrymore even takes on a supporting role as Donnie's English teacher in the movie. So I thought that was fantastic. And and Richard Kelly's direction is just astonishingly confident, for a first time director. He perfectly just balances, the 80s teen angst drama with that metaphysical horror and dark comedy, just really creating this tone that is just entirely unique. And while his later films, like Southland Tales and The Box, they all show that same kind of thematic ambition. Just neither has captured that cultural zeitgeist in the same way as Donnie Darko. And Donnie Darko really feels like this lightning in a bottle moment where this young director's unfiltered creativity just aligned perfectly to produce a piece of art that was both deeply personal and just universally resonant. Um, and this movie was released shortly after the September 11th attacks, which is why it wasn't talked about a lot upon its release. Um, so the film's marketing, which just features a crashing plane, was understandably pulled back, and it led to this very unfortunate, disastrous box office run. And initially, but like I said, like a lot of these movies I talk about on here, its true life began on home video, and Donnie Darko ended up becoming one of these kind of quintessential cult classics of the new millennium. And it found its audience through word of mouth. It did, but that word of mouth wasn't from me, as I explained to you earlier, because my friends didn't want to listen to me. They just want to act like they'd never heard of it when they did finally watch it. But like I said, it did. But however, despite my experience, it did, gain this audience through word of mouth and just these kind of late night DVD viewings and VHS viewings or whatever you're watching it on. Just the ambiguity of it was its greatest strength. Is Donnie this schizophrenic hero, a time traveling messiah, or is he both? Just the film never gives a definitive answer on that, and it just really invites this endless interpretation and just debate that still rages on to this day on the internet. Um, and that's just the impact of it is just far reaching. The film soundtrack, just that kind of pitch perfect collection of just 80s post punk and new wave artists like Echo and the Bunnymen and Joy Division just became iconic. And like I said that earlier, that Mad World cover at the end, just really it became this surprise international hit, just forever entwined with the film's kind of melancholic soul. And Donnie Darko just also kind of helped pave the way, for this kind of new wave of indie cinema that just wasn't afraid to blend genres and challenge, its audience. Its influence can be seen in everything from television shows like Mr. Robot to films that play with kind of, complex, non-linear stories. For many, it has become this kind of annual Halloween tradition, including for myself. And just it's a film that really captures, that eerie, introspective spirit just of the season, which is far, better than any, conventional horror movie. Um, but Donnie Darko it is more than just a movie. It's this kind of puzzle box, a mood piece, just a profound emotional experience. It's a love letter to the outsider. A meditation on that painful, beauty of just adolescence and just that mind altering, exploration of choice and destiny. And for a fan of these kind of tangled timelines, it presents one of the most unique and just satisfying temporal loops in cinematic history. You know, one based not on paradoxes, but on emotional and that spiritual necessity. And just for a lover of Halloween, it's setting in the heart of October, culminating in this Halloween party. Just it makes it this perfect film. I feel to watch, as the veil between worlds feels at its thinnest. Um, it's a film that really stays with you, for years. I mean, this film has stayed with me for 20 years now. Um, and for over 20 years actually, and just it's this very haunting whisper that just reminds us that every living creature on earth dies alone. Um, but within that solitude, there can be beauty and purpose and just a strange and sad kind of hope. Um, so this is an absolutely beautiful film. Highly recommend it. I'm in love with this movie. Have been for over 20 years. Um, so definitely, watch Donnie Darko if you have never seen it. Especially watch it around this time of year, and it'll, if you're a Halloween lover, if you're a lover of time travel and just psychologically beautiful films like this, then you will not regret it. But now that brings me to the last movie on tonight's stream that I want to be talking about. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier when Jason was talking about it in the chat. And he's absolutely right. This is a movie that was talked about quite a bit when it initially came out, but it doesn't seem to be get talked too much about nowadays. And I'm hoping for anybody that's watching this that I can change your mind on it, because as a lifelong horror fan, um, you know, like I said, I love this time of year. It's my favorite time of year. Halloween is my favorite holiday. Um, so I always love to watch these movies that are based around the time of Halloween. And even though this film doesn't take place, on Halloween until the end of the film, I could not leave this one out, because this is a movie. Once you watch it, it sticks with you forever, because it gives you such an uneasy feeling. Um, and you know, like I said, there are films that just like this one, which is Lucky McKee's 2002 Jim May. Uh, it's definitely, I feel like it should has it should ascend to a more higher status. It's a film, much like the iconic Mask of Michael Myers. This movie has this very haunting simplicity that just kind of burrows deep into your psyche and just refuses to leave. Um, so May is just not your typical jump scare, gore soaked slasher flick. Instead it's this very um, well crafted psychological horror that just kind of delves into the chilling depths of just loneliness and just that society being alienated in society and just that kind of desperate human need for connection. So the film centers on May Kennedy, who's just portrayed with this heartbreaking vulnerability by Angela Bettis. May is a woman who is defined by just her deep seated isolation, just which is a consequence, of just a difficult childhood, which was marked by her being bullied. And just, through her childhood, um, physical defect, if you want to call it that. I hate calling that, it sounds awful. But, she has a lazy eye. And so, and it's been physically, corrected with glasses. Um, the the emotional scars still remain with her though, and it just leaves her socially awkward and just perpetually on the fringes of human interaction. And just her sole companion, just a constant fixture, and from her childhood and into her adult life, is this pristine, glass encased doll named Susie, which was a childhood gift from her mother, um, which her mother gave her advice: if you can't find a friend, make one. So this instruction becomes kind of a twisted mantra for May's adult life. Um, and May's kind of fragile, existence begins to fracture when she develops this intense infatuation with this guy named Adam, who is this, he's a local mechanic with this kind of captivating allure, and, particularly, she's in love with his hands. Um, and just their relationship is kind of fraught with with May's increasingly unsettling behaviors and just a prelude to the psychological unraveling that is to come later on. um and just just adding another layer to May's complex social landscape is her coworker Polly. Again, so we just mentioned her earlier, played by and she's played by Anna Faris here. And Polly is, I'm not sure if they don't really, I don't think they ever say, I'm not sure if she's a lesbian or if she's bisexual, but, she just exhibits this very clear romantic interest in May. So the film kind of subtly, weaves in elements of just longing and desire, and it highlights May's inability to navigate these connections. Um, but the turning point, and which is a moment that really echoes that unsettling, thrill of a perfectly placed Halloween scare, is when May invites Adam to her apartment, and he screens this short film that he made called Jack and Jill, which is this kind of dark tale of these two lovers, who resort to cannibalism. And just this whole disturbing story, rather than it repelling May, it just ignites this kind of perverse arousal inside of her, and just culminates in this passionate kiss where she ends up biting Adam's lip, drawing blood from him, and and she just rubs like his blood all over her, and so it kind of and Adam like is just very turned off by this. He's horrified by her intensity. So, and it serves as kind of this brutal rejection, of May, and it just leaves her utterly devastated, and just and it reinforces her sense of her feeling worthless. Um, and just in her anguish, she lashes out at Susie, her only confidant, shoving her into this cupboard, and um, just which is a symbolic act of abandonment, that mirrors like the rejections that she has just experienced with Adam. So May, she then seeks solace by volunteering at this daycare center for these blind children. So here she finds kind of a almost a flicker of understanding um, with this young child who creates this clay ashtray for her, and they imprint May's name into the surface of the ashtray. So this kind of small gesture, of genuine connection, just offers a brief kind of respite for May. However, her yearning for Adam, coupled with Adam's public disdain for her, you know, pushes her back towards Polly, her friend that she works with. Um, and so their affair begins, but it's short lived. May overhears Adam later, expressing his disgust for her to his friends, which is just a fresh wound, that just sends her spiraling, and when she seeks comfort, you know, from her cat, uh, who ends up ignoring her in her distress, May's rage just boils over, and so she throws the ashtray and fatally injuring the cat, and just shattering, the precious handmade gift that the child had made her. Uh, let alone killing the cat. But the just so that the fractured pieces of the ashtray, like you know, just almost like the shattered pieces of her life, I guess, becomes a symbol, of just this growing fragmentation. So this is where the film just truly starts to, embrace its kind of horrifying potential. It's a descent that just feels as inevitable as the the season of Halloween approaching us in October. You know what I mean? So it's like May's grip on reality starts to loosen. She begins to believe that Susie is speaking to her. So she takes the doll to the daycare center and introduces her to the children as her best friend. Um, so their innocent attempts to remove Susie, from her protective case leads to this chaotic accident, injuring the children, May, and just destroying the doll, just pushing May further into despair. If she already wasn't at like one of the lowest points, like now this is just made it even worse. And in this moment, just where innocence collides with May's fragile um, state of mind, is just a chilling testament to the film's ability to kind of tap into primal fears. And the film's kind of descent into pure horror just culminates with May's encounter with this young punk, played by James Duvall, who played Frank in Donnie Darko. So, like, we got a couple of instances where we've seen some reoccurring actors in these films I'm talking about tonight. But like I said, this young punk played by James Duvall, who has this Frankenstein's monster tattoo on his arm. It sparks his interest, in this unique aesthetic. So uh, they're at May's apartment, and he sees this cat's corpse in her freezer, and he calls her a freak. And this that's the last straw for May. So this final brutal insult just breaks May completely, and just driven by this desperate need to recreate the connections that she craves. But in this kind of grotesquely twisted way, she decides that she needs more parts. So the climax is set on Halloween night, which is just a perfect backdrop for this twisted transformation. May, who just adorns herself in this homemade costume, which eerily resembles the outfit that Susie wore, and she just embarks on this brutal spree. She murders both Polly and her lover Ambrosia with these surgical scalpels, and then she visits Adam and his girlfriend, dispatching them with just the same efficiency. And then she returns to her apartment and she constructs this life-size doll, which is just a patchwork Frankenstein-like monstrosity assembled from the body parts of her victims, and like the punk's arms and Polly's neck and Ambrosia's legs, Adam's hands. Um, and then I believe she used the cat's fur for the hair for on the head of this life size body part filled doll that she's created. So and the shattered like ashtray shards are rearranged to form this kind of anagram that reveal the doll's name, which is Amy. And in this kind of final disturbing act of just self mutilation and desperate connection, May gouges out her own lazy eye and places it into Amy's head, just pleading with the doll to see her. And as she collapses, just bleeding and broken, Amy, with Adam's hands, caresses May's face. And May smiles, and in that moment, it is both terrifying and just profoundly tragic. And I think that's just a testament to the film's kind of unsettling, exploration of, the human condition. Um, and like I said, May is the directorial debut of Lucky McKee. Lucky McKee's a filmmaker with this very distinctive and often unsettling style. Um, Lucky McKee is celebrated for his ability to just craft, atmospheric, character driven horror that just kind of delves into the darker corners of human psychology. And while May is arguably, I think, his most widely recognized work, um, he has continued to just explore similar themes of isolation and obsession and just the unsettling nature of everyday life in films like The Woman, and All Cheerleaders Die. Um, his his works often features these strong female protagonists who navigate complex and often dangerous emotional landscapes. He has a knack for creating a sense of just that creeping dread and just unease and just kind of those cheap scares for a more profound psychological terror. um, and despite its initial box office disappointment, May has really carved out, I think, a significant niche as a cult classic, in my opinion. Like I did say earlier, it isn't talked about as much as it was when it first came out, but it definitely has its fan base out there. Um, for as its legacy kind of continues to grow for horror fans, particularly those who, appreciate, a more nuanced and just character focused approach to the genre. May is definitely a treasure. Its impact can be seen in just its influence on independent horror, just showcasing that effective scares don't always require massive budgets or over the top gore. Just this film has a very slow burn story to it, and its exploration of just loneliness as a driving force for horror. Um, And and it's sympathetic, although deeply disturbed, protagonist just resonated with, a segment of the audience that was looking for something more, substantial than just typical, what the genre would normally offer. Um, but the film's resonance with that kind of DIY aesthetic of Halloween is also undeniable. May's creation of her costume, um, just her very twisted construction of Amy, and just the overall atmosphere of the film really echoes that handmade, often amateurish yet deeply heartfelt decorations and traditions that are associated with Halloween. It really taps into that idea of just creating something out of nothing, of imposing one's will on the world, although in a very terrifyingly distorted manner. Um, so this whole DIY spirit, combined with its very thematic, resonance with alienation, that desire for belonging, it really makes May a film that kind of feels linked to the spirit of Halloween for a lot of fans, including myself. Um, and and furthermore, May is just often cited as this significant film in that lonely girl, horror subgenre, which just explores like the anxieties and potential dangers that's associated with like social isolation and just that that desperate pursuit of of human connection. Angela Bettis's performance is just central to this legacy. I mean, it's top notch. She just imbues May with this profound sense of you know we're just making her journey from being this pitied like outcast to this homicidal creator, which is both horrifying and in a twisted way understandable. Um, so this kind of complexity is really what elevates May, beyond this simple horror film, and just really solidifies its place in that world of like cult classics. That its independent spirit and its willingness to explore uncomfortable truths about human nature just continue to earn it new fans. I couldn't tell you how many people I have told about this film and gotten them to watch it, and they have absolutely loved it. Um, and just like I said, so it's still you know uh earning its legacy by word of mouth out there amongst a lot of fans who've loved it for years. So it's gaining this critical appreciation as the years go on, and I definitely I think it deserves that place up there as one of those like eerily creepy, yet um, you sympathize with what's going on with this character. And I just really think it's ensured its place in the annals of horror history. So if you've never seen May, I believe it's on Tubi for free. I think that's where I watched it this time around, which I also have it on DVD as well. But if you've never seen it, definitely check it out. Highly recommend it. Uh, super underrated, super underrated film. Um, but guys, I guess that is it for tonight's episode. Like I said, I will be back tomorrow night, Saturday night, on the 25th. So that'll be around like 10 or 11 tomorrow night. I'll be doing the next stream. And then again on Sunday, I'll be doing a stream as well to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Back to the Future, the original Back to the Future. And I'll also be covering its sequels as well, part 2 and 3. So the whole trilogy will be talked about this Sunday night. So if you're a fan of Back to the Future, if you know anybody that are fans of Back to the Future, definitely don't want to miss that one. But like I said, I guess that's it for tonight. I want to thank everyone who either watched this live or who was here in the chat or if you're watching this on replay, just thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. Please drop me a comment below on what your favorite movie is that I talked about tonight, if you've seen any of them. If not, just let me know what your favorite, Halloween movie is to watch around this time of year, whether it be from the actual Halloween franchise or it just be a Halloween themed movie. And as always, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I really appreciate that. That would help me out a lot. And if you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button below to catch more videos from me like this one. And always click that bell for any future notifications. But I guess with all that said, I'm Crater. This is CraterMania. I love you guys. Have a good night.